The winter sun of 1240 sits low over a frozen pass in the lands of the Russes. 100 men hold a shield wall. The wood is split. The iron is dented. Beyond it, a wall of dust climbs from one edge of the sky to the other. That dust is breath. The breath of 10,000 horses. The golden horde has come. The ground stops being ground. It shakes. It hums with the weight of what is riding in. Count the numbers, and it is madness. 100 against 10,000. No one survives that. These 100 are what remains of the Varangian Guard, Norsemen, axemen who swung two-handed blades taller than a child, exiles who once guarded emperors in Constantinople and princes in Kiev. They have crossed the known world and left scars on all of it. Now they have no emperor, no coin, no road left to run. At the front stands a giant. Nearly 2 meters of mail and bare fur. He has never studied a map in a warm room. He knows one thing, older than any kingdom. Hold the ground, and you hold the ending. The Mongols have already burned Moscow. They have flattened Vladimir. Kiev is ash and silence. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, has forgotten what losing feels like. But this pass is narrow. And in this frozen throat of rock, for the first time in a generation, fear is about to switch sides. It starts with one choice, made by one man who would not kneel while the whole world lay face down in the snow. Tell us which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. Take a second to subscribe and support this project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. A black stain spread across the map of the Rus, and that was how the world ended. Not with fire falling from heaven, not with the sea rising to swallow the land. It ended slowly, patiently, one burned village at a time. The Mongols moved faster than the rumor of their own coming. Leather, iron, and horseflesh. All of it one living storm that ate whatever it touched. Each rider led 3 or 4 spare mounts. When one horse tired, the man swung to the next without breaking stride. An army that never slept and never stopped. A courier of the horde could cover more than 100 miles in a day on the arrow relay stations, the yam, that Genghis had strung across the steppe. News of them arrived, if it arrived at all, at the same hour as their arrows. They drank mare's milk soured into a sharp liquor. They ate meat softened under the saddle as they rode. They opened a vein in a horse's neck and drank the blood when there was nothing else, then sealed the wound and kept moving. An army that carried its own food on 4 legs did not need a supply line. And an army with no supply line could not be starved out. The men of the settled world had built every defense they owned against a foe who came, sat down, and waited. This foe never sat down. To stand in their path was to be scrubbed from memory. Resistance was not a problem they solved. It was an insult they answered. And the answer never changed. They leveled cities. Then they stacked skulls where the gates had stood. This was not an army. It was weather. And weather cannot be fought. The men leading it had learned their trade under Subutai, the general who had crossed the Caucasus in 1223 and broken a Rus's coalition at the Kalka River. There, after the battle, the Mongols bound the captured princes, laid heavy boards over them, and feasted on top while the men suffocated beneath the weight. No blood was spilled. To the Mongols, this was an honor. Noble blood should not touch the ground. That was the mind now marching west. Subutai had studied the Russes for years before he struck. He knew the princes hated one another more than they feared any outsider. Vladimir would not send men to save Ryazan. Kiev would not lift a hand for either. The Mongols did not need a bigger army than the Rus. They needed only to fight them one city at a time, and let the old grudges do the rest. By December 1237, they had reached Ryazan. The city sent envoys to beg terms. The Mongols asked for 1/10 of everything. 1/10 of the horses, 1/10 of the silver, 1/10 of the people. The Prince of Ryazan gave his answer through a proud line the chronicles remembered. "When we are dead," he said, "you may have it all." 5 days later, the walls came down. The chronicler at the monastery wrote that no eye remained to weep for the dead, because none were left alive. Then came Kolomna. Then Moscow, still a small wooden fort on the river, burned in the winter of 1238. Then Vladimir, the seat of the Grand Prince, its cathedral packed with women and clergy who had climbed to the upper gallery for safety. The Mongols piled timber against the doors and set it alight. The gold-domed church became a furnace. Grand Prince Yuri II had ridden out to gather an army on the Sit River. He never saw the smoke. On the 4th of March, 1238, they found him and cut his host to pieces. Later, Bishop Kirill, searching the frozen field, recovered the prince's headless body by the cloak still clinging to it. The head was never returned. A local tale outlived the ruin of Ryazan. A boyar named Evpati Kolovrat came home to find the city gone, gathered 1,700 survivors, and chased the horde down. He struck their rear so hard that the Mongols, when they finally killed him with a siege engine, gave his body back to his men out of respect. The chronicle claims Batu himself said that if such a man had served him, he would have held him to his own heart. That was the temper of the land the horde now crossed. Broken, yes, but not empty. This was the shadow that now crawled toward Europe. And in the vanguard's certainty, a mistake was growing. They reached a slim gap in a frozen valley. The locals had a name for it: the Kolodny Pass. The place was a wound in the land. 2 ridges of dark rock leaning close, a floor of packed snow between them, the wind funneling through so hard it stripped the frost off the stone and threw it in your eyes. Pine grew along the heights, black against the pale sky. Below, a stream ran under a skin of ice, and you could hear it moving even when you could see nothing. Old bones lay half buried at the mouth of it, the ribs of horses that had died there in some winter no one remembered. The local men would not graze animals in the pass. They said the wind carried voices. The Mongols sent no riders ahead. They left the high ground bare. Why bother? The Russes were finished. Their princes lay dead or in iron. Their armies were fields of bone with crows working the leather. To the commander at the front, the thought of survivors hiding in some crack of the mountains was not a threat. It was a punchline. Everyone worth killing was already dead. The world had surrendered. It just hadn't been told yet. Inside the pass, a man watched them arrive. Call him Bjorn, the one they said could not be broken. He stood on a shelf of rock, still as the stone under his boots. He did not see an army. He saw a river of men certain it could flow through any land it chose. He had 100 men, 100 against 10,000. They were the last of the Varangians, Northmen who had rowed south down the great rivers, past Novgorod, past Kiev, all the way to the walls of Constantinople. There they had served in the emperor's own guard, the axe-bearing foreigners the Greeks called the Varangian Guard. Their fathers had cut their names into the marble of the Hagia Sophia and carved runes into the shoulder of the great marble lion at Piraeus, graffiti still legible 8 centuries later. Their forefathers had marched under Harald Hardrada, the Norwegian who served the Byzantines in Sicily before he fell at Stamford Bridge in 1066, and the old songs of that guard still passed from mouth to mouth around their fires. These were men whose memory stretched across the whole world. Now they had no emperor, no wages. The Rus's prince who last hired them was Ash. They were exiles guarding a pass no one had asked them to hold. Any other commander alive would have called the retreat, scatter into the peaks, by a day, by a week. Bjorn was not any other commander. He looked at the valley and did not see a grave. He saw a funnel, a corridor of rock and ice, barely 50 meters across. In open ground, the horsemen would be at his flanks in seconds. They would ring his 100 and cut them down like penned cattle. But in this throat of stone, their best weapon was worthless. Speed died here, and numbers turned into a burden. 10,000 men could not reach him at once. Only 50 could. Bjorn had bent the battlefield into arithmetic. Mongol speed reduced to 0. 10,000 reduced to 50. It was the same lesson a Spartan king named Leonidas had taught at a coastal pass called Thermopylae, 17 centuries earlier. A narrow place makes numbers a lie. Bjorn had never read Herodotus. He did not need to. He had learned it with his own hands. He climbed down. His face gave nothing away. He did not order a retreat. He ordered the line to close. He walked the line before it formed. A man named Ulf, gray in the beard, had lost 2 fingers years ago and lashed his axe to his wrist with a leather cord so it could not fall. A younger one, barely bearded, was praying under his breath, not to Christ, but to the old thunder god. A third, a Greek speaker they called Michael, had followed these men out of Constantinople and never left. Bjorn said nothing to any of them. He put a hand on each shoulder as he passed and moved on. That was the whole speech. He had chosen the ground with care. He set the wall where the corridor pinched tightest, so the enemy could bring the fewest men to bear. He kept the low winter sun at his back, so it would burn in the eyes of the riders coming up the pass. Small things, the kind of things that decide who lives. The vanguard crested the ridge. The outriders, the glory hunters. Young men raised in the saddle, itching for their first real kill. They looked down at 100 men standing in the snow on foot. And they laughed. They actually laughed. It was too easy. A knot of bearded savages in heavy mail, gripping axes that looked too big to lift. The officer leading them did not wait for the main body. He did not wait for foot soldiers. He saw a quick win, and the honor stitched to it. He gave the order. The sound started as a low rumble. It climbed into thunder as thousands of unshod hooves struck frozen earth. The ice on the stream cracked and jumped from the shaking of the ground. The horse archers drew their composite bows. Weapons built from wood, horn, and sinew, glued and cured over 2 years, able to drive an arrow through mail at 100 paces and loosed backward at full gallop. A dark cloud rose into the pale sky. Bjorn's men did not move. They did not flinch. They did not even look up. They shuffled tighter, shoulder pressed to shoulder, until the 100 became one body. The shields rose and locked. Not the small round shields of raiders. Tall kite shields, lime and oak, a full inch thick, banded in iron, faced with hardened hide. A wall that walked. The Skjaldborg. The arrows landed. Not a volley. A weight. A flood of steel and goose feather hammering down on the shields. The noise swallowed everything. 1,000 iron hammers on 1,000 anvils all at once. Wood split. Shields groaned. A few arrows slipped through the seams and buried themselves in a shoulder, a thigh, with a wet thud. A man 2 down from Bjorn took a shaft through the eye slit of his helm and dropped without a sound. The man behind him stepped into the gap before the body finished falling. Then the cloud passed. The wall still stood, bruised, battered, whole. The ground before them bristled with spent shafts, so thick a man could not have set his foot down between them. The 100 had not given up a single step. The charge closed to its last 10 meters. Then something strange happened. The war horses refused. Bred for aggression, trained for the noise and blood of battle, they still balked. Instinct told them the thing ahead was not a line of men. It was a cliff. They swerved, they reared, they slammed into the riders behind. The charge, all its force built on momentum, collapsed into a heap of screaming animals and cursing men. In that heartbeat of chaos, Bjorn gave his only order. Not a word. A cry pulled from the base of his lungs, the sound of a hunter loosed. The wall did not open to run, it opened to bite. 100 Dane axes rose and fell as one, each head heavy, bearded, honed. These were not dueling swords. They were tools built to split a log in one stroke. A man split the same way. The front rank of the vanguard simply stopped existing. An axe, head of 5 pounds, falling 7 feet at the end of an ash shaft, does not kill cleanly. It takes apart. Heads left shoulders, arms left bodies. One stroke went through a rider's leather and deep into the horse under him, killing both with a single crunch. Ulf, the old man with the axe lashed to his wrist, took a horse's foreleg off at the knee and let the animal's own weight drag the falling rider onto his second stroke. This was not a battle. It was slaughter run like a workshop, inside 50 meters of stone. The officer stared. His best men had been erased before they could draw a saber. Then he made his second mistake of the day. He read discipline as luck. He read endurance as weakness. He decided the savages must be spent, their one trick already used up. He sent the second wave. But there was no charge left to give, no room to build speed. What came instead was an avalanche of bodies. Riders at the rear, blind to the butchery up front, shoved forward. They pressed the men ahead into a wall of flesh and bone and shrieking horses. Packed too tight to swing a blade. They could only push, a tide of men trying to crush the shields by sheer weight. Bjorn watched the pressure build. He saw it in his men's faces, in the strain on their shields, in the burn spreading through their arms. He let it climb. He let it reach the edge of breaking. Then he barked a single word. Skipti! The command lived in their muscles. Drilled 1,000 times in the dusty yards of Constantinople, where old veterans of the Guard had beaten the drill into them under the eye of officers who spoke Greek. 1,000 more in the mud of the Rus. The spent front rank of 50 stepped back. The fresh rank behind stepped forward. It took the length of a breath. Every time a Mongol thought he had finally worn his enemy down, thought he had found the crack, a new man rose in front of him. Arms not yet tired. Grip still sure. Eyes cold and clear with hate. Hope started to die in the bottleneck. The Mongols were fighting a thing that would not weaken. A thing that renewed itself from within. The killing went on. The Varangians stopped being men. They became a machine, a single engine of death, perfectly timed. Step forward, swing, step back. Let the next man take your place. Again. Again. The dead began to stack. At first they were in the way. Then they became a rampart. A meter of corpses and gutted horses that the cavalry could no longer push through. Steam rose off the pile where the warmth of the dead met the frozen air. a low fog that hung across the corridor and hid the wall behind it. The charge stalled, momentum gone. Now the Mongols were a still, panicked mob, trapped between the wall of shields ahead and the crush of their own army behind. For the first time in a generation of conquest, the Golden Horde swallowed its own medicine. They had built an empire on speed and fear. In the Kolodny Pass, the speed was gone, and the fear no longer answered to them. Somewhere behind the mass, a Mongol captain tried to call a withdrawal. His voice was lost. The men at the front could not have obeyed him if they had heard. They were wedged into a killing floor by their own comrades, dying because their own army would not let them run. A few threw down their weapons and clawed at the rock walls, trying to climb out. The ice gave them nothing to hold. One rider drew a knife and cut his own saddle straps to slide off and crawl beneath the horses. He was trampled before he reached the second rank. The men holding that line were the last of their kind. Living history, a thread running straight back to an age of iron and blood. They fought for more than one more sunrise. They fought for the memory of every shield wall that ever held, from the fields of Stiklestad to the gates of the Holy Land. Stories like this are fragile. They vanish under the dust of empires that rise and fall. The work we do here at Ancestral is to be the shield wall for these stories. We hold the line so they are never lost, but we cannot hold it alone. We need our own second rank. Join our membership club, The Lineage, and you take your place in that line. You stop being only a viewer. You become one of us. An insider who keeps these documentaries alive and makes the next one possible. If these stories matter to you, click the Join button and step into the ranks. You get early access to our videos and the knowledge that you are personally keeping this history out of the dark. The sun slid behind the frozen peaks. Long shadows spilled red across the snow. Then the Mongol horns sounded. Retreat. The note came out ragged and unsure, a sound they were not used to making. The horsemen pulled back. They left proof of their failure behind them, a wall of their own dead, stacked 3 deep. The stream at the valley floor ran black now, dammed in places by bodies, pooling and freezing at the edges. Bjorn's men stood in the quiet, leaning on their axes, breath rising in the frozen air. Spent, bleeding, alive. They had held the pass for a day. They had done the thing that could not be done. They counted their own. 11 dead. 19 too hurt to hold a shield by morning. 70 left standing. Against them, the snow was covered with hundreds of the horde. Michael, the Greek speaker, walked the line pressing snow into the wounds to slow the bleeding, because there was no fire and no cloth to spare. The young one who had prayed to the thunder god sat with his back to a rock and did not get up. An arrow had found him under the arm during the last exchange. Ulf closed the boy's eyes with 2 fingers and said nothing. But looking out over the wreckage, Bjorn felt nothing like victory. This was not the end. It was not even the beginning of the end. It was only the end of the beginning. The Mongols had been arrogant. They had been foolish. They were not stupid. And a day's ride back, in a tent hung with the banners of dead kings, the man who had burned Kiev was about to hear that 100 men on foot had stopped his army in a ditch. Batu Khan did not forgive. And now he was coming himself. The Mongol officer could not make sense of it. His riders were the pride of the horde, stopped, not by an army, by a fence of wood and men who would not move. Hundreds of his own lay in the snow now, frozen into the shape of the pass, a dam of dead flesh blocking the way forward. Shame burned in his stomach. He knew what waited for a commander who failed. The Mongols had a law, the Yasa of Genghis, and it did not bend. An officer whose unit broke and ran could be put to death with his whole 10. The army was cut into tens, hundreds, thousands, tumens of 10,000, and each level answered for the one below it. Cowardice was not a private sin. It was a crime against the 9 men roped to your fate. He could not turn back and stand before the Khan a failure. He could not push ahead. So he chose the only thing left to a man out of ideas: spite. He screamed up at the archers on the slopes. The order was 3 words: kill them all. The sky went dark a 3rd time. But this storm did not aim. The arrows fell into the packed corridor without care for whose flesh they found. On the Varangians they struck like sleet on a shield roof. The tall boards took the weight. The mail and iron helms turned aside what slipped through. But for the Mongols, crushed in the pass, it was butchery. They wore leather and silk, cut for the saddle, not for standing under a rain of their own bodkin points. Under the silk, many wore a shirt woven from raw Chinese thread. It was meant to catch an arrowhead, so a man could draw the shaft out clean by pulling the thread. It did nothing against a point falling from above at that range. Men fell with arrows in their backs, killed by the friends behind them. Horses that were already mad went madder, and trod the wounded into the ice. The finest cavalry on earth turned into a screaming animal eating its own tail. The officer had not broken Bjorn's line. He had broken his own. But chaos does not take sides. One arrow, loosed at a steep angle, spun down and found the one seam a shield could not guard. It struck Alaric, the one-eyed man who stood at Bjorn's right, in the throat. The point drove through the mail at his neck. He made a wet sound. His good eye went wide. His axe left his hand. He grabbed at the shaft, then folded, and a hole opened where he had stood. Alaric had lost the other eye at the siege of a Bulgar town years before. A splinter of stone off a wall the Mongols themselves had thrown down. He used to say the missing eye saw farther than the one he kept. He had stood at Bjorn's shoulder in 3 campaigns. He was the man who called the count when Bjorn's voice gave out. He had carried a small bronze cross from Constantinople, worn smooth, that he touched before every fight. Now he lay face down in the red slush, and the wall had a mouth. The Mongols nearest saw it. Their panic turned to hunger. They threw themselves at the gap, sabers up, trying to tear it wide. Bjorn saw Alaric fall. He saw the breach. He did not call for someone to plug it. He dropped his own shield. He took the long axe in both hands, the ash haft worn glass smooth by years of gripping, and he stepped into the gap alone. The first Mongol swung. Bjorn did not block. He let the saber skate off the plate on his shoulder and brought the axe around low and fast. It caught the man across the belly and opened him. He reversed the swing and drove the spike on the back of the head through the second man's face. He wrenched it loose and stood over both, dripping, and roared into the ones still living. Close ranks. 2 young Varangians, faces white, jammed their shields into Alaric's place. One of them was the brother of the boy who had died in the first day's arrows. He did not look down at his own feet, where the dead of both armies were stacked knee-high. He looked forward, and he held. The mouth shut. The wall was whole. The Mongols looked at the giant painted in their friend's blood, and their nerve went out of them. The retreat drums started, quick and ragged. As the last red light slid off the peaks, the horde pulled back. The first day was over. Night did not settle over the Kolodny Pass. It dropped like a lid, and it brought the cold with it. 20 below. then 30. The wind came down the corridor off the high snowfields and carried a fine ice dust that stung any patch of bare skin. The wounded on both sides stopped dying of their wounds and started dying of the freeze, blood thickening to slush inside them. A man with an open cut felt the wound go stiff, then numb, then still. Some of the burned begged for water and got snow, and the snow froze their lips shut. Out beyond the wall, in the dark, the Mongol wounded called to their own gods in a dozen tongues, and one by one the voices stopped. By first light, there would be a rime of frost on every open eye in the pass. Bjorn did not sleep. He walked the line in the dark. He crouched by each man, checked each bandage, passed his own water skin along. He named them as he went, because a man who hears his own name at the edge of freezing sometimes holds on. He had them chew strips of frozen horse meat cut from the dead animals in the pass, because a man who does not eat freezes faster. He set the fittest to walk in slow circles rather than sit and stiffen. He counted them. 93. 93 men against an empire. He knew what the empire was. He had seen it from the inside. Batu Khan led the Western campaign, grandson of Genghis, given the lands of the sunset as his share of the world. But the mind behind the war belonged to Subutai, an old man now, one-eyed and too heavy to sit a horse without help, who had marched under Genghis himself and had never lost a field. Subutai did not care for glory. He cared for the ledger. He had crossed the Caucasus, ridden around the Caspian, and beaten army after army on that long raid 20 years before, learning the ground the way a merchant learns a road. He had beaten the Russes once already at the Kalka by feigning retreat for 9 days until the pursuers strung themselves out and could be swallowed whole. 100 men holding a pass was a line in his ledger that would not close. That was why the sounds Bjorn heard next did not surprise him. A groaning from the Mongol camp, ropes, whips, the strain of oxen in harness, wood dragged over frozen ground. They were bringing up the engines. The Mongols did not build such things themselves. They had learned them. When Genghis broke into northern China and took the Jin cities, he spared the engineers and put them to work. Now, Chinese siege crews traveled with every Mongol army, hauling their catapults across the steppe in pieces and raising them in a day. Some worked by counterweight, some by rows of men hauling ropes on a single shouted signal. To drag them all this way to kill 100 men on foot was not strategy. It was a message. The Khan was no longer insulted. The Khan was afraid. At midnight, the arms of the catapults groaned back and let go with a crack that rolled off the ridges. What came over the black sky was not stone. It was fire. Clay pots of naphtha and oil, trailing flame, shattering against rock and shield, throwing sticky, burning liquid in every direction. It stuck to the wood. It soaked the pelts and wool. It ran into beards and hair. In seconds, the wall came apart into something out of nightmare. Men burned where they stood. They flung down their shields and clawed at their helms. The smell of cooking fat and singed hair filled the corridor, and the fire threw the whole pass into a swinging orange light that turned the rock walls the color of a forge. Bjorn read it at once. The fire was not meant to kill them. It was meant to scatter them, to drive them out of the throat and into the open dark where the archers waited. "No one moves!" His voice tore through the screaming. "Smother it! Use the snow! Do not break the line!" They obeyed. The drill was deeper in them than fear. Burning men dropped and rolled in the bloodied slush. Others scooped ice and pressed it to a comrade's flames with bare hands, and the burning oil took the skin off their palms as they did it. They stood. For 2 hours the fire pots kept falling, and they held under a rain of liquid hell. 7 men who had lived through the whole day were reduced to black, twitching shapes. One of them was Ulf, the old man who had lashed his axe to his ruined hand. He could not free the cord fast enough. He burned upright, still gripping the haft, and the men beside him swore afterward that he never made a sound. They died without raising an axe against anyone. They died because their commander told them the line mattered more than any one life, and they trusted him. Then it stopped. The quiet after was worse than the noise, and into that quiet came a new sound, the even tread of boots on frozen ground. 1,000 of them, the heavy infantry, not the light riders now. Captured engineers and Turkic conscripts pressed into service, cased in lamellar iron, small plates laced together in rows, carrying long pikes and heavy cleaving swords, built to gut a wall that would not move. These were men fighting for a Khan who was not theirs, driven forward from behind, told that the men to either side of them would die if they turned back. The Mongols called these levies the hashar, the herd, and spent them first so their own would not have to bleed. Many had been marched here from cities that no longer existed. They came on slowly, a hedge of iron points feeling through the dark toward the burned and bleeding survivors. At 20 meters, they stopped. A single figure had climbed onto a flat rock in the middle of the pass. He was beating his axe on his shield, slow, even. A drum beat. Clang, clang, clang. The sound bounced off both rock walls and came back doubled, so it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Some of the levy men crossed themselves. Others touched charms sewn into their collars. A few in the front rank stopped walking and had to be shoved forward by the men behind. Bjorn was not hiding. He was calling them in. From the shadow behind the rock, 86 men rose together. Burned. Cut. 10 to 1 against. Not broken. They shifted into a new shape. Not the wall. The Svinfylking, the boar's snout. A wedge for attack, the heaviest men at the point, the shape the Northmen had used since before there were kings in the north. Bjorn dropped down to take the tip himself. He lifted the axe. For Valhalla! 85 throats answered, and the cry rolled up the pass ahead of them. These were baptized men, most of them, men who had knelt in the great church in Kiev under the gold mosaics. But dying, they reached past the new god to the old one, and the wedge charged. Downhill, into the 1,000 climbing up. This was the last thing Bjorn had built, and he had built it in silence. The naphtha had done more than burn his men. It had melted the top of the ice across the pass. In 30 below air that meltwater had frozen again, a sheet of black glass under a skin of snow and frozen mud. The Mongol infantry wore the smooth leather soles of the steppe, good for gripping a stirrup and nothing else. No grip on ice. The Varangians wore boots studded with iron nails, the kind Northmen used on the wet decks of a longship and the frozen rivers of home. Bjorn had ordered the studs hammered in the night before, while the enemy dragged their engines up the valley. He had heard the melt under the fire and understood what the cold would do with it. The wedge hit the line. The line did not bend. It came apart. The front rank skated backward, as if the ground had turned to grease, crashing into the rank behind, and the fall ran through them like a wave. Men windmilled their arms. Pikes went useless. They floundered like cattle on a frozen lake. A man who fell in that press did not get up. The weight of his own comrades came down on him, and the ice held him there. The Varangians stood anchored. Every blow carried the full weight of hip and shoulder, driven off solid footing. The axe did not need an edge in these conditions. Weight and speed did the work. Heads crushed inside helmets. Collarbones shattered. Breastplates held their shape, while the ribs and organs behind them turned to pulp. A pikeman tried to set his spear against the charge and could not brace his back foot. The point wandered, and the axe took his arms off at the shoulder before the wedge rolled over him. Behind him, a Turkic conscript threw down his sword and raised empty hands, and no one had the time or the mercy to stop. The boar's snout drove straight through the middle of the army, splitting it in two, cutting a lane of dead through the slipping mass. In the Kolodny Pass, 10,000 meant nothing. 1,000 meant nothing. Only the ground under your feet mattered. And Bjorn owned the ground. A fight like this cannot be understood from the story alone. You have to go down into the source, into the unflinching record left by the men who stood there. The main source behind this script is a work of dark, patient research, a book that takes you by the collar and drops you into the mud and blood of the 13th century. It is available right now. Click the View Products button on your screen. Owning it is the only way to grasp the full weight of what happened in that pass. And when you open that shelf, you will find more than a book. We have gathered a set of dark relics, pieces built to pull you deeper into this world. Explore the shelf. See which artifacts are waiting. Open it now and keep walking with us while we return to the slaughter. The wedge had gutted the infantry, but this was not a border raid. This was the Golden Horde. They were an ocean, and Bjorn's men were a spit of sand the tide was grinding down. Every man he lost, he could not replace. Every man they lost, 10 more waited behind. That was the arithmetic Subutai counted on. Bjorn counted his own as he fought, a running number in the back of his skull, and the number kept dropping. 80. Then the two brothers went down together, and it was 78. The younger one had held Alaric's place only hours before. Just as it seemed the Varangians might cut a road clear to open country, a new sound crossed the noise. One horn, low and long, from the Mongol rear. Not advance, not retreat. Stop. The infantry, still on their feet, scrambled back and parted like a drawn curtain. Through the gap, a figure stepped into the firelight. A giant, near Bjorn's own size, sheathed head to foot in black lacquered plate. The armor kept for the Keshig, the Khan's own guard, men chosen from the sons of commanders and sworn to die before the Khan took a scratch. They ate before he ate. They slept in a ring around his tent. Their number was fixed at 10,000, and to strike one of them was to strike the Khan himself. They were sent forward only when the Khan wanted a thing done that ordinary men had already failed to do. He carried no sword and no spear. He carried an iron mace, black and heavy, made for one thing, to cave in armor and the man wearing it. The whole pass went quiet, even the wounded. Bjorn lowered his axe and looked at the man across the ice. His own boots had grip. He noted, without wanting to, that the giant's soles were black leather like all the rest. Then the man took a step, and Bjorn heard it. A hard bite into the ice. Short iron cleats strapped over the black soles. The small hope in his chest went cold. This one had been told about the ice. This one had come ready. For the first time in 2 days, Bjorn had found something in this valley he could not simply outthink. The fight for the Kolodny Pass was about to enter its last stage. Behind the giant in black plate came 12 more. The Keshig, the Khan's night guard. They moved without wasted motion, hands resting near the curved hilts at their belts. These were not conscripts. Each had been chosen from the sons of commanders, and a single one of them outranked an officer of 1,000 line troops. To command them in the field was to hold the trust of Batu himself. Genghis had built this guard from 10,000 men and slept inside its ring every night of his life. A man who struck a keshig without cause could be put to death for it. The giant stopped 10 paces from Bjorn. He said nothing. He raised the iron mace and pointed it at the Varangian's chest. The meaning needed no tongue. It was older than any tongue. One leader against another, to the death. Bjorn looked at the champion. He looked at the 12 behind him. He looked past them, at the sea of men that filled the pass from wall to wall. Behind the front ranks stood the tug, the horse-tail standard on its pole, 9 tails of a white stallion bound below the iron trident. Where that banner stood, the command stood. He understood what was being offered. A test. Accept, and he would likely die. The man across the ice was rested. Bjorn had been killing since first light, his body one long ache of cracked knuckles and torn muscle. Refuse, and the thing holding his men together would come apart. They believed they could not be beaten. Let them see him flinch, and the belief would die. He turned his head, not enough to break his eyes from the champion. "Rest," he said. The word came out as gravel. "This one is mine." The duel did not open with fencing. It opened like 2 rock slides meeting. The champion came forward, mace held low. He was no swordsman. He was a wrecker. He swung a flat, scything arc meant to take Bjorn's legs out from under him. Bjorn did not block. Blocking that weapon meant broken arms and an axe knocked from your grip. He jumped, the iron studs biting the ice, and the mace head hissed under his knees. The champion reversed it faster than a man that size should move, bringing the weapon up and over toward Bjorn's skull. Bjorn threw himself sideways. The mace came down on the frozen floor of the pass. It did not strike the ice. It broke it. A pit of shattered rock and frozen mud burst outward, spraying stone chips like grape shot. One shard opened a line across Bjorn's cheek. The shock of the blow traveled up through his own legs where he crouched, and he tasted iron. He took the opening. As the champion hauled the mace out of the crater it had punched, Bjorn lunged, aiming not at the man, but at the weapon, trying to hook it and pin it. The champion was too quick. He let go with one hand, let the mace pivot on the other, and swung his gauntleted fist backhand. An ugly move. It worked. The steel knuckles caught the side of Bjorn's helm. The world went white. A great bell tolled inside his skull. He staggered. His rhythm broke. In that half-breath, the champion swung the mace flat and level. Bjorn got his guard up a fraction too slow. The iron head took him in the ribs. Not a cut. A collision. He felt the bones give. With a wet grinding he felt more than heard. The blow lifted him off his feet and threw him 2 meters back. He landed in frozen mud, the air torn out of him in one ragged gasp. 10,000 throats roared. The sound came off both walls of the pass and rolled down the valley like thunder searching for a way out. The myth had fallen. The champion came on at a walk, the mace rising for the last blow, an executioner nearing the block. He was in no hurry. He wanted the whole army to see it done. Face down in the mud, blood in his mouth, his side one long line of fire, Bjorn stopped being a soldier. He became something older. A boy in the frozen forests near the Dnieper's headwaters, hunting bear with his father in the years before Constantinople. and his father's one rule came back to him. Never watch the teeth. Never watch the claws. Watch the feet. The feet tell you everything. His eyes, swimming with pain, left the falling mace and locked on the champion's boots. He saw the cleats set. He saw the weight shift. He saw the back leg tense to drive the strike home. As the mace started down, Bjorn moved, not up, forward. He drove off his one good leg and slid on his belly across the ice and mud, straight between the champion's braced legs, as the mace crashed into the ground where his head had been, and flung frozen earth over his back. Now he was underneath, behind the guard, the one place all that armor could not reach. In one motion, he hooked the bearded blade of the axe behind the champion's right knee, in the gap where the plates ended and the leg bent, and he pulled. Every scrap of strength left in him went into it. There was a sound like a wet rope parting under load. The hamstring tore. The giant's supporting leg was ripped out from under him. He toppled backward with a strangled cry and fell the way a siege tower falls, the iron cleats scoring long white lines in the ice as they lost their grip. Before the man knew he was down, Bjorn was on him. He dropped the axe, drew the long sayax from his belt, and drove the blade two-handed into the seam between helmet and breastplate. The plate had turned 100 blows. It could not turn a knife pushed into its one open throat. He twisted it. The giant went still. Bjorn pushed himself up. He stood over the body, swaying, his chest a bag of broken bone. He turned to face the army. Silence. 10,000 men staring at one. The roar had died in their throats. Somewhere, a horse stamped, and the sound carried the whole length of the pass. In that quiet, a fear was being born. The Mongols were a people of omens. They read the shoulder blades of sheep in the fire to know whether to march. They would not spill royal blood on open ground for fear of what it woke. They saw signs in everything, and the sign in front of them now was plain. If that man could not kill him, who could? The 12 remaining Keshig broke it. Faces twisted, they abandoned their line and charged, sabers out. Their last mistake. To leave formation without the order was itself against the Yasa, but grief for their champion had burned the law out of them. The Varangians, who had been watching with their hearts in their mouths, let out one sound together, a single animal roar, and fell on the charge. It was not a fight. It was butchery in reverse. The 12 were hacked apart before they could dress a line. One of them, cut across the back of both legs, kept trying to rise and swing until 3 axes came down at once. 2 men dragged Bjorn back behind the shields and propped him against a rock. One of them, Sven, had lost his left ear to a saber in the night and had bound the side of his head with a strip torn from a dead man's shirt. "Are they leaving?" a young one asked, hope raw in his voice. Bjorn coughed a clot of blood onto the snow. He shook his head. "No," he rasped. "Now they are offended. Now comes the sea." The night that followed was the coldest yet. The wounded who could not be kept moving died where they sat. By the gray hour before dawn, Bjorn had them stack the frozen dead into a low breastwork across the neck of the pass, a wall of their own fallen to slow what was coming. The living chewed the last of the frozen horse meat and drank melted snow from cupped hands. No fires. Fire would blind them to the dark, and they needed the dark. Down the valley, the Mongol camp burned 1,000 fires, and the smoke of them hung over the pass and blotted out the stars. Somewhere in that camp, priests of a dozen conquered faiths were kept on the payroll of the Khan, and men went to all of them that night. A Nestorian Christian among the Turkic levies knelt in the snow and prayed to a cross the Mongols let him keep, because the Yasa forbade insulting any god. Bjorn knew whose army this was, down to the bones of it. Batu commanded, but the war was Subutai's, the general who had ridden 3 empires into the dirt and never lost. And every man in that valley carried the same catechism. Genghis had spoken it, and it had never changed. The greatest joy is to crush your enemies, to take what is theirs, to see those dear to them in tears. These were men raised on that. 100 axemen who would not run was not just an obstacle to them. It was a blasphemy against everything they believed the world owed them. At dawn, the whole valley was a field of heads, spears, and banners. The Mongols had brought up everything. No vanguard now, no champion, only the horde. The rising sun caught the frost on 10,000 helmets at once, and for a moment the pass seemed to be filled with cold fire. Crows had gathered on the ridgelines in the night, black against the snow, and they did not fly. They only watched and waited for the men to be done. Bjorn leaned on a fresh axe, his chest bound tight with strips of torn linen. Every breath cost him. He looked at what was left. Fewer than 40 men could still raise a shield. The rest were dead or dying in the snow. He gave his last order. Not a wall, not a wedge, a ring, a knot of steel in a plain of red. "Lock shields," he said. "Die on your feet." He passed among them one more time. To Sven, he said nothing, only gripped his shoulder. To the youngest, a boy from Novgorod, who had joined them only that autumn to escape a debt he could not pay, he said, "Keep your feet under you, and your eyes on mine." Then he took his own place in the ring, where the wall of dead met the living. The tide did not charge. It pressed. Sheer weight closed in from every side. The fight became a war against smothering. The dead were held upright by the crush, and the living used them as shields. No room to swing. No room for skill. Only the desperate work of drawing one more breath, striking one more blow, lasting one more heartbeat. The sound was not the clash of open battle. It was a low grinding, thousands of men breathing and shoving in a space too small, punctuated by the crack of an axe finding bone. The ice underfoot went to red slush, and men fought ankle-deep in it. A young Varangian slipped on a frozen loop of gut. He went down, and the ring cracked. The horde poured in through the gap like water into a holed hull. The circle came apart into single men fighting alone. Bjorn found himself on a small island of stacked corpses. He saw one of the old men go down with 4 spears in his chest, his hands still shut around a Mongol's throat. He saw the smith, the quiet one who had reforged half their axe heads over a riverstone fire, vanish under a mass of trampling boots. He saw the Novgorod boy pulled off his feet and lost in the press before he could cry out. A mace he never saw struck the back of his head. His sight swam. His legs emptied. He dropped to one knee. The battle roar sank to a dull hum, and his father's voice came up through it. "Get up. If you die on your knees, they win." With a sound that seemed dragged out of the ground itself, he forced his boots flat and stood, swaying. The men in front of him stepped back without meaning to. Their circle opened, not for another duel, to let the archers through. They formed a line 5 meters off, bows drawn. They no longer wanted to reach the beast with their hands. They wanted it put down. Among them, an officer barked the order to hold, to wait for the word, so that no man could later say he had struck first and taken the shame or the glory alone. Bjorn looked at the row of bows, at the mix of hate and dread on the faces behind them. He understood. He let the axe fall from his numb fingers. It rang on the ice. He spread his arms wide, giving them the target. He pulled one last breath into his ruined chest and threw his voice across the silent pass. "Loose, and tell your Khan it took 10,000 of you to kill one man." 12 arrows hit his chest at once. Heavy war shafts, made to punch plate at 50 paces. At 5, they landed with the weight of hammers. The blow should have thrown him flat. His body should have gone down under the force of it. But the iron studs would not let go of the ice. His knees locked, and he stood, dead and standing. 12 black shafts jutting from his body, a thing that should not be. The archers lowered their bows. Their hands shook. A young soldier whispered to the man beside him, his voice breaking. "Why won't he fall?" The officer who had given the order did not answer. He had heard the old men speak of spirits that could not be killed twice, and he did not want to be the one to say the word aloud. Some of the men touched the charms at their collars. One turned his horse away and would not look. Another loosed a second arrow without command, then dropped his bow as if it had burned him. Then gravity took its due. The giant pitched forward, not back in defeat, but toward the enemy, as if in death his only thought was to close one more meter, to take one more throat with him. He came down across the wall of his own dead, and the sound of it was the last sound in the pass. With that fall, the spell broke, but it left a mark. The Golden Horde marched on. They took Kiev that December of 1240, and the siege engines that could not break 100 men in a pass broke the greatest city of the Russes in 9 days. They battered the Polish gate until it fell, then fought street to street until the last defenders crowded into the Church of the Tithes, and the roof came down under their own weight. A papal envoy named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, who passed through the ruins 6 years later on his way to the Khan, wrote that he found a field of skulls and bones, and barely 200 houses still standing in a city that had held tens of thousands. The people were slaves, he said, or dead. They crossed the frozen Vistula into Poland and burned Krakow to the ground on Palm Sunday of 1241. In April, they split their force in two. One wing met a Polish and German army under Duke Henry at Legnica on the 9th of April and destroyed it. Henry was captured, beheaded, and his head paraded on a spear before the walls of the town. And after the battle they cut one ear from every enemy dead and filled 9 great sacks to count the fallen. The other wing rode into Hungary and, on the plain of Mohi by the Sajo River on the 11th of April, shattered the army of King Bela and left the kingdom a wasteland. A chronicler there wrote that a man could ride for days and see no living soul, only the unburied and the burned. From the Vistula to the edge of the Adriatic, no field army could stand against them. But they never forgot the frozen throat of the Kolodny Pass, the place where 100 men on foot held the greatest army on earth for 3 days, where the men who meant to swallow the world learned, for the first time, the taste of their own fear. In the yurts of the veterans years later, the story was told with the voices low, and no one who told it claimed the giant had ever truly fallen. Mothers on the steppe used the tale to quiet children. "Do not wander," they said, "or the standing dead man of the West will find you." Then, late in 1241, riders came in from the Far East with news that changed everything. The great Khan Ogedei, third son of Genghis and master of the whole empire, had drunk himself to death in December at his capital of Karakorum. By the law of the steppe, the princes of the blood had to ride home for the Kurultai, the great assembly where the next Khan would be chosen. Batu had claims of his own to press, and enemies among his cousins, chief among them Guyuk, whom he would not leave to seize the throne unwatched. He turned the horde around within sight of the Austrian frontier. The armies that had crossed half the world went home to argue over a dead man's chair. Europe never learned how close it had come. It never knew that a part of its reprieve had been bought in a narrow pass in the lands of the Rus, where a dead man on iron-studded boots had refused to fall, and taught the unconquerable that they could bleed. Thank you for standing with us to the last breath of this story. If you believe men like these deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and send this to someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you were sitting when you watched this and which moment stayed with you. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Another story is already waiting for you. The video on your screen right now is your next step into the dark. Click it. Keep walking. We will be there.